Our first speaker is Dr. Emma Cohen, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Anthropology and Mind and at the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at the University of Oxford. Dr. Cohen has carried out ethnographic fieldwork on an Afro-Brazilian religious tradition in Belém in northern Brazil, focusing primarily on concepts, behaviors, and practices associated with spirit possession. Her first book, The Mind Possessed, The Cognition of Spirit Possession in an Afro-Brazilian Religious Tradition, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2007, combines cross-cultural ethnographic analysis with perspectives and findings from the cognitive sciences. Since its publication, Dr. Cohen has been carrying out a program of experimental research along with Justin Barrett, who at least we at Emory can see him in our screen there, to address a variety of cognitive questions generated by her ethnographic findings. Now, those experiments have focused principally on how people across cultural and religious contexts represent the relationships between minds, bodies, and persons. Now, in addition to The Mind Possessed, Dr. Cohen has published numerous articles and papers in such journals as Ethos, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and the Journal of Cognition and Culture. The title of Dr. Cohen's talk today is Savage Thinkers and Soulless Psychology, the Cognitive Anthropology of Religious Experience.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
We're hearing you fine.
Okay, we just lost you for a moment there. Thank you very much, Professor Macaulay, I should say. I would like to add to your thanks, and those that have gone before, my thanks as well, to all the people who have organised this, but especially a personal thanks for the invitation to present here today. I'm going to try and conserve my voice a little on the volume and compensate for that with a bit more clarity than I might normally have, and I might try and pace myself. I've been suffering with a bit of a cold, and I'm not sure how long my voice is going to hold out. So unbeknownst to Harvey, if it all gives up at some point, I'm just going to pass my notes along to him, and he can carry on.
Yes.
So he's agreed to that. Okay. And the purpose for this talk really is just to describe some recent developments, not all, in the cognitive anthropology of religion, which in many ways is a new approach to the study of religious experience. Okay. Now, it would be problematic, if not a little reckless, to claim that one's approach is new without actually knowing much about what came before, or the relevant work that other people have been doing in neighbouring disciplines. We wouldn't want to be guilty of reinventing the wheel. A brief trip down the memory lane of anthropology reveals, quite unsurprisingly, that there is quite a lot of the cognitive anthropology of religion that isn't really all that new. The cognitive anthropology of religion, quite simply, has inherited, revived, or reinvented questions that date right back to the discipline's founding fathers. But a new approach to these questions has entailed the borrowing of methodological and conceptual tools, more recently developed in newer and emerging disciplines within the cognitive sciences, including cognitive psychology and developmental psychology. Of course, many of these tools aren't all that new anymore in their respective disciplines, but their application to long-standing problems in anthropology has enabled considerable progress. So in the first part of my talk today, I'll aim to do a little historical situating of the work that I and others participating in the conference today are doing. So we're not so much reinventing the wheel as adding crucial detail and a bit more colour. What is this thing called religious experience then? Religious experience is not normally taken as synonymous with religion. We tend to think of religion as more than or other than religious experience. We think of certain religions as affording more or less religious experience, and of some scholarship as being primarily about religious experience, and other scholarship as being about some other aspect of religion. What is religious experience then? Well, undoubtedly there are several people here today who are much better placed to discuss this than me, and I doubt that we'd reach an agreed upon consensus. But for the purposes of this talk, something like the following would probably serve sufficiently well. Religious experience, also known as spiritual experience, sacred experience, or mystical experience, is a subjective experience where an individual reports contact with a transcendent reality, an encounter or union with the divine. And that's from the authoritative and anonymous annals of Wikipedia. Now, as some of you may know, I have carried out some ethnographic work with a group of Afro-Brazilian religionists. The majority of my friends in the field claim to have regular and remarkably direct encounters with transcendent realities and unions with the divine. Here's how one of them described his first such experience. I started to become unconscious. When a person wakes up, they feel kind of disoriented. I started to feel like that. At a certain point, I started switching off, and then the moment arrived at which I switched off completely, and I don't remember anything more. Then I woke up. Now ask yourself, what makes this experience specifically religious? What is religious about becoming unconscious? I do it every night, and even some afternoons when I get a chance. I've been knocked unconscious on the squash court, but I was never once tempted to call that experience religious. So he says, I started to become unconscious, I switched off, I don't remember anything, and then I woke up. It's not the most gripping of narratives. And from another, I did things I wouldn't normally do, and when I came to, when I woke up, I would be called retarded, crazy. It was as if I was sleeping. I wasn't aware of what I did. I expect you might be thinking, yes, but they think that their experiences are possession. That's what makes them different. That's what makes them religious experience. Well, that's exactly the point I want to make. Look at how these two individuals further framed their experiences. The first says, the first time I became possessed was on the 20th of July, 2001. I don't have the exact time, but it was at night. I became cold from my feet upwards. It took over me gradually. I started to become unconscious. When a person wakes up, they feel kind of disoriented. I started to feel like that. At a certain point, I started switching off, and then the moment arrived at which I switched off completely, and I don't remember anything more. Then I woke up. It seemed as if I had been sleeping. He continues, I used to feel the energy of the caboclo, the vodun, the orisha, various spirit entities, as if it was an energy that tried to dominate me, but it couldn't dominate completely. I would become disoriented, not knowing what I did, spinning, getting dizzy. And through various rituals that would help him develop his mediumistic abilities, he says, I would get possessed completely and I wouldn't remember anything more. The second individual says that his first contact with the culto afro, the Afro-Brazilian religion, was at 14 years of age, when, he says, I first started to have spiritual manifestations without knowing where they came from. I didn't know what it was. I was embarrassed. Sometimes when I was at school, I was taken by this force. Until that point, I didn't know what it was. I completely lost control of my body. I did things I wouldn't normally do. And when I came to, when I woke up, I would be called retarded, crazy. It was as if I was sleeping. I wasn't aware of what I did. One day I was playing football at the front of my house with some friends. That force took me, and it was the first time that it identified itself. It identified itself as Rosinha Malandro. Others described their early possession experiences as like dying, accompanied by shivering and preceded by pounding headaches, as vibrations of a cosmic energy they feel coming into their bodies. It's a kind of sleep, according to others, or a feeling of coldness, as one described, from the tips of your toes, then running through your spine, and then you cut out, or literally, you are no longer in yourself. At that point, the spirit is believed to have taken over. So a basic point I really want to make about this today is that religious experience is not content-free, and by that I mean that it is not thought-free. Religious experience, the vibrations, trance, energies, shivers and chills, nausea, warmth, emotion, and so on, is framed by thoughts and by interpretations of those experiences. And these thoughts and interpretations also shape the experiences. Accordingly, if we wish to explain religious experience, however we define it, we need to know how and why people represent these experiences in certain ways, particularly as experiences of God or gods or some other kind of special agent. Why do they even attend to certain experiences in the first place? Why this experience? And why are some explanations and interpretations of those experiences that are attended to intuitively more fitting, more prevalent, more cross-culturally recurrent, and more historically persistent than others? These, of course, are big questions, with a long pedigree, which brings me to the first main part of the talk. And as first speaker here today, I probably shouldn't allow too much time to go by without mentioning William James. So here he is. But the person I really want to talk about today is James's contemporary, Edward Tyler. Tyler was the founding father of Oxford Anthropology, having been appointed the first professor of anthropology here in 1895, already in his mid-60s. His best known and most influential work, Primitive Culture, was published sometime earlier, in 1871. The themes are broad and continue, quite strikingly, to be very current in the evolutionary behavioural sciences: the evolution and survival of culture, language acquisition, mathematical reasoning, mythological themes, the universality of spirit beliefs, the purpose of religious rites, and so on, all based on survey, otherwise, sometimes quite disparagingly, sometimes affectionately, known as armchair anthropology. But one of his principal aims in Primitive Culture was to investigate the deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings. Tyler is often associated with the term animism. And by animism, Tyler was referring to the general belief in spiritual beings, a belief that is historically ancient and whose origins and evolutionary course he was concerned to trace. His concern with origins is often taken primarily or exclusively to be about historical or evolutionary origins, but in fact his most cogent and prescient suggestions actually concern cognitive origins. He posed questions about the conditions under which these ideas about spiritual beings were likely to be elicited, and supposed that people came up with concepts of souls and spirits in response to recurrent cognitive problems. In other words, problems about how best to represent the world around them, how to interpret and explain it. Problems such as what makes the difference between a living body and a dead one? What happens when we dream? It sure feels like we experience the things we dream in a very real way, that we visit places and talk to people and see things, but how so if the body remains motionless and asleep? Tyler speculates that it was in response to such conceptual problems that the soul concept came into being, describing it as an animating, separable, surviving entity, the vehicle of personal existence. And this was a description, a definition that was distilled from much survey work of various missionary reports and explorer reports and early ethnographic reports at the time. In this vast survey of soul concepts, he describes how people across the globe attribute a wide range of states or experiences to the departure of the soul from the body: unconsciousness, sickness, trance, fainting, sleep, dotage, dreaming, and death when it willfully leaves and doesn't return. But why do people link these experiences with ideas about souls? Well, this was a question that Tyler really tried to get a grip on, and he places great store in what he calls the evidence of the senses. For example, he says, and his approach is framed very much by evolutionary progressivist theories of the time that distinguished on a scale of evolutionary progression the primitives, or savages as they were called, kind of at the bottom of the scale, right in the early stages of evolution of culture, through to the civilized races, as he saw it. But anyway, he says that there's no reason to think that this belief in souls and spiritual beings, that this belief was learned by savage tribes from contact with higher races, nor that it is a relic of higher culture from which the savage tribes have degenerated. For what is here treated as the primitive animistic doctrine is thoroughly at home among savages, who appear to hold it on the very evidence of their senses. Ideas about souls, then, answer in the most forcible way what it is that makes the difference between a living body and a dead one, for example. As such, they are rational products of human psychology, readily generated and developed to account for basic facts of nature. So basically, Tyler was interested in the psychological mechanisms whereby primitive and civilized philosophers arrive at the concept of the soul. He even seems to be surprised that human thinkers don't think more about how they think. He says the savage thinker, though occupying himself so much with the phenomena of life, sleep, disease, and death, and we could add all manner of religious experience, as we call it here, seems to have taken for granted, as a matter of course, the ordinary operations of his own mind. It hardly occurred to him to think about the machinery of thinking. And so-called civilized man wasn't too far ahead. Indeed, the civilized world's perspective on the operation of human minds until relatively recently, had assumed the very notion that Tyler wanted to explain, that humans have souls, and from souls comes thinking. So Tyler had some great ideas, looked in some very promising areas, raised some really big questions, and generated a certain amount of theory and some partial answers. But like the people he studied, he had no grip on the causal mechanisms giving rise to widespread forms of thinking and behavior. The model was a black box one of experience in, soul concepts out. At this point, all he could say was that there has arisen an intellectual product whose very existence is of deepest significance, a psychology which no longer has anything to do with the soul. Hence our soulless psychology in the title. But where are we today with regard to the soulless psychology of savage and civilized thinkers? Well, the cognitive sciences as we know them today didn't really come into existence until the mid-20th century. And it has really only been in the last 2 to 3 decades that anthropologists, not all, but a number, have begun to incorporate cognitive scientific approaches into their own work on how people think, and therefore how ideas spread and persist. For example, in explanatory theory in the domain of religion, the anthropologist Stuart Guthrie, in his 1993 book Faces in the Clouds and Other Papers, describes a human predisposition to detect human-like agency in the world, and suggests that this predisposition is wired for hypersensitivity, such that we see agency where there is none. Justin Barrett has developed a similar account, branding the cognitive mechanism responsible for this bias the hypersensitive agency detection device, or HAD. He describes HAD as a survival-enhancing mechanism, or disposition, that encourages the production of superhuman agent concepts in many situations, and makes MCI concepts, or supernatural agent concepts, minimally counterintuitive. It's a broader category than supernatural agent concepts, but MCI agent concepts even more salient, believable, and likely to be spread by anchoring them to personal experiences. To echo Tyler, HAD is a core mechanism for the mediation of evidence to the senses. It is a tool, among many others, by which we perceive and interpret the world and our experiences of it. The evidence for the basic operations of our agency detection mechanisms, how they develop in infants and children, under what conditions they are activated, and so on, is now vast. It is not coming from anthropology, but mainly from developmental and cognitive psychology. There is now convergent evidence that we have multiple perceptual sensitivities to potential signs of agency, and that these are among some of our earliest emerging components of cognition. This research is getting right at the heart of Tyler's question about how human minds come up with the solution to the problem of what differentiates living bodies from dead ones, intentional agents from inert objects. And true enough, it really doesn't take too much to trip these agent detection systems. So Tyler's soul lives on in cognitive anthropology. But what can recent developments in cognitive psychology tell us about religious experience, and in particular, spirit possession? Well, one very promising area of research is concerned not just with identifying the cognitive processes that give rise to and allow causal reasoning about the world, but how cognitive mechanisms actually constrain the ways in which we think, and the ways, therefore, in which ideas spread. Cognitive systems are a bit like digestive systems in this sense. Digestive systems allow us to eat and to absorb energy from food, but they don't cope with all food thrown at them equally well, and they certainly heavily constrain the kinds of things we take in. You can try eating an aeroplane, but your digestive system won't thank you for it. Likewise, minds allow us to think, but they process some inputs more efficiently than others. They therefore constrain the range of stimuli and information out there that are likely to be attended to, thought about, and remembered. Let me briefly illustrate with some of my own work on spirit possession. As you may recall, my fieldwork participants broadly described their trance experiences in similar terms. as involving dizziness, lethargy, heaviness, normally whilst they dance and sing, followed by something that feels like sleep. These experiences are attributed to the possession of a body by a spirit. But what does possession mean here? Participants in this cult house were taught that possession occurs when a spirit fuses or merges with oneself. This fused entity, the medium and the spirit, subsequently animates the medium's body to sing and dance and joke about or offer advice and so on. Despite being taught this definition of possession, participants, both those who experienced possession and those who observed, offered quite a different version from that of the cult house leader who instructed them. The most frequent model did not entail a fusion, but a displacement, in which the spirit entered the body, thereby ousting the medium from their body. All behaviours during the possession episode were attributable to the spirit and not the medium. Although both models, displacement and fusion, may be encountered in the ethnographic record, displacement is the most widespread description of possession trance. So being interested in how cognition informs the emergence, stability and transmission of cultural forms, I wondered, why is displacement, this idea that when the spirit possesses, the host leaves or at least cedes control, so common cross-culturally? And related to this, in the Brazilian context, why does the displacement concept persist, even in the face of theological correction and instruction? And this is really going back to the second of those big questions that I highlighted at the start of the talk. Why this interpretation or explanation? Why is this one so recurrent in this particular cult house, contrary to religious teaching and prevalent cross-culturally as well? Well, one possible answer is that intuitive assumptions about the relationship between minds or spirits or agency and bodies structure mental models of spirit possession. For example, perhaps there is a universal intuitive expectation that there can only be one mind or person controlling a body at a particular time. Two minds simultaneously controlling a body, or two persons merging together and so on, would therefore be cognitively cumbersome and a difficult concept to implement in social perception and cognition, and is therefore not likely to spread as well as something that's much easier to grasp. Alternatively, perhaps something about the subjective experience of possession trance requires that it be displacement. Perhaps possession concepts out of the context where it is practiced, where representation, where these ideas are not constrained by the experience of possession trance, may not consistently follow a displacement model. An obvious question then is, how do people think about spirits, mediums and possession and so on, where possession is not practiced and no elaborated cultural models of possession exist? How do people who have no exposure to official teaching conceptualize spirits entering bodies? Do possession concepts outside of possession cult contexts follow a displacement model? In the absence of explicit religious teaching, are concepts convergent or are they divergent across the population? So we conducted a range of studies with a population of UK students that cumulatively suggest that displacement has a cognitive advantage in cultural transmission. And I'll briefly report the results of a couple of these studies today. Okay, so the first study looked at the question of whether displacement comes more spontaneously to mind when thinking about one person going into another person's body. So in this study, we asked participants to imagine what would happen if one person's mind went into another person's body. And in this case, we had 51 students from Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and they were presented with mind transfer scenarios involving two girls called Beth and Anne. And Beth's mind goes into Anne's body. Importantly, no possession model was specified. We didn't say possession, we didn't talk about spirits and so on, because we didn't want to tap into people's specific models of possession, but into their assumptions about the elemental conceptual building blocks of possession. In other words, their ideas about minds and bodies. The fundamental assumption driving our investigation is that concepts of possession and spirits and so on do not have special, exclusive cognitive supporting structures of their own, but are supported and constrained by the same cognitive structures that guide ordinary, everyday thinking and intuitions about persons, bodies, minds, and the relationships between them. Possession concepts simply exploit the cognitive tools we have for solving other common problems in our social and physical environment. So participants in this study were asked to consider 10 mind transfer scenarios and to predict the consequences of the transfers on the post-transfer girl's behaviour. It will become clearer in a moment. So Beth's mind goes into Anne's body. How will this post-transfer girl perform on X, Y, and Z? And there were 5 control items in this study, featuring behaviours that largely hinge on physical aptitudes and capacities, such as visual acuity, and 5 mental items that were concerned with behaviours that largely have to do with mental skills, such as ability at maths, for example. Here's one of our control items. Anne is really fast. She typically runs 50 metres in around 6 seconds. Beth is not so fast. She typically runs 50 metres in around 8 seconds. One day, as Anne was about to race the 50-metre sprint, Beth's mind went into Anne's body. What do you think the girl's time was? Okay, and we had 4 other control items, one involving appetite, and these are all measured on slightly different scales, of course. Appetite, speed, as you just saw, strength, visual acuity, and cigarette smoking. And here's an example of a mental item. Anne is very good at maths. She regularly gets excellent marks on 7-point quizzes. Usually around 6 out of 7 of her answers are correct. Beth is very poor at maths. She regularly gets poor marks on 7-point quizzes. Usually around 2 out of 7 of her answers are correct. Once when the girls were in maths class, Beth's mind went into Anne's body. How well do you think the girl did in the maths test? Okay, and in this particular questionnaire, we did vary up the order in which people saw the questions, and also who was generally sort of per. So it wasn't always Beth that was doing per on everything in every example. And here are the rest of the mental items. We had storytelling skill, emotional expression whilst watching a film, sociality, and food preferences. So here are the results. First of all, we're interested to see, did people distinguish between the physical and mental items? Because if you remember, Beth's mind goes into Anne's body. So one hypothesis might be that Anne will continue to maintain her physical aptitudes pretty much intact. We might expect the mental to change ever so slightly. And that, in fact, is what we find. So at least on my right, should be everybody's right, I think, you get the cluster of the 5 physical items. The 2 lower ones are the smoking and appetite, which we might expect as being intuitively seen as entailing both physical and mental aptitudes. But overall, this cluster of items is significantly higher than chance, so significantly more in the direction of continuing according to the Anne typical score. And they're significantly higher than this lower cluster, the 5 that are the mental items. And what we see here is a radical change towards more Beth typical scores. So Beth's mind goes into Anne's body. Anne doesn't simply become Beth. She retains her physical aptitudes pretty much intact, but mental aptitudes change. So having established that they're distinguished between these groups of items, we're then further interested in how they actually characterize the nature of the transfer. So these scores in the mental items are of particular interest. Are they rating this change in terms of a displacement or in terms of a fusion? And so we did a participant analysis in which we measured the number of participants who gave consistently fusion responses and those who gave consistently displacement responses. So what makes a consistent displacer? Well, on our scales of responses, if they gave a Beth typical score, then that was a displacement response. If they gave 4 or 5 out of the 5 responses as Beth typical scores, then they were consistent displacers. And the same for fusers. If they gave anywhere else on the scale or any other item, any other measure, then they were consistent fusers on 4 or 5 out of the 5 items. So this is the result on our participant analysis. There were 4 out of the 51 participants who were consistent fusers, and 30 out of the 51 who were consistent displacers, and 17 out of 51 who used a mixed strategy, but using a less conservative criteria. So who just used fusion most and who used displacement most? We had 42 using displacement most, 8 using fusion most, and 1 was mixed. I think this person had left an answer blank. So the transfer was characterized as a displacement consistently across mental items and not as a fusion. And here we give people the opportunity to give some explanations for their answers. And here's what some typical responses on the maths aptitude question that you saw. So some of them said, one of them said, Beth's mind isn't very strong at maths, so this would affect Anne's performance, as it isn't Anne's physical appearance that makes her good at maths. Beth's mind is still there in Anne's body. It's her mind that will help her answer the questions, not her body, so she still won't do well, and so on. Even in Anne's body, it's still Beth's mind. Her mind answered the questions, not her body. Mind and body are separate. Beth, who is not good at maths, will still not be good at it, regardless of whose body her mind is in. And Beth, who is poor at maths, now has her mind in Anne's body, and therefore Anne cannot excel. And what's interesting about these is that participants' explanations for their responses, in these explanations, displacement is assumed. It's assumed, but it's not articulated. No one explicitly mentioned that when Beth's mind enters Anne's body, Anne's mind would be displaced. Their further explanations here and responses indicate that this assumption is implicitly driving their reasoning, however. So this study suggests that displacement may be a more intuitive model of mind transfer, and that when presented with the idea of a mind entering another's body, it is assumed that the entering mind displaces or eclipses the host's mind. And this, the idea is that this study closely parallels the structure of the concept that is elicited in a possession trance context also. We did some other studies, and I'll just report one more here. It was a narrative recall study in which we were interested in whether people would find displacement more memorable than other studies. So again, we're looking at these cognitive advantages to this particular concept. If it's more memorable, then it's going to perhaps transmit easier. It's going to hang around for longer. It's going to be more persistent. And in this study, we added another concept that we sometimes find in the possession record. So we don't only just find displacement and fusion, but sometimes, particularly in the film industry, we find something that looks a little bit more like oscillation. So where we have two characters kind of vying for control over one body, having intermittent control, a rapid sort of changeover of control over the body. And so we included this one as well in this narrative recall study. And in it, participants listened to an audio recording of a futuristic newscast. And this newscast reported on a conference at which beings from various planets had gathered. And of primary interest were three beings representing three different models of the relationship between minds and bodies: a displacement being, a fusion being, and an oscillation being. And these were described in the narrative. Oh, really? Okay, good. So since I've got some time, I might let you hear exactly what they heard. Now, I want you to bear in mind that we asked them afterwards, after a small distractor task, we asked them afterwards to recall just what the professor said, because in this newscast, a very special professor, a professor of intergalactic anthropology, was interviewed. And we asked them just to recall that part of the narrative. We had three different recordings, varying the order in which these beings appeared as well, to counterbalance that. And afterwards, I'll tell you what we got in way of results. So bear with me, and I've got I'll need to flick through this first. There we go. Okay.
We bring you breaking news from a planet in a little-known region of a distant galaxy. A conference is taking place about which Earth has received no previous intelligence. Reports suggest that it is an interplanetary summit. Beings from numerous neighbouring planets have gathered together to discuss a subject of which we remain largely ignorant. What we do know, however, is that this is no ordinary lineup of participants and speakers. The leading world expert in the field, Professor Richard Levy from the Oxford Institute for Intergalactic Anthropology, was with us in the studio earlier.
Yes, beings from the various planets represented have some very special abilities indeed. These abilities are possibly the product of eons of natural selection in their different ancestral environments. All these alien beings normally appear physically similar to humans. We know that they have similar brains, conscious experience, and are able to think and remember. We have received some intriguing reports, however, about the exact nature of some of their very unique abilities. One being has 6 limbs. He appears to communicate using an elaborate form of gesturing or sign language. He uses all hands and feet as well as the full limbs. Although the being uses speech also, this gesturing seems to be important for communication. Another being is able to enter the body of another. The being completely fuses his mind with the being whose body has been entered, and simultaneously they control his body. This means that if, for example, if I were one such being, I could enter the body of another being and fuse with that being, we would merge together and control the body's behaviors. Another being is able to enter the body of another. The being whose body has been entered and the other being intermittently control the body. This means that if, for example, if I were one such being, I could enter the body of another being from my planet, and I would sometimes have control, and sometimes the host would have control over the body's behaviors. Another being is able to enter the body of another. The being whose body has been entered may remain conscious, but is unable to control his body. This means that if, for example, if I were one such being, I could enter the body of another being from my planet, and have complete control over that being's body. The host being is unable to control the body's behaviors. Another being has two heads, one of which is always asleep. This means that the person can remain constantly in a state of alertness. When one mind is tired, it may sleep, and the other mind will take over. We are almost certain that each of these alien beings is from a different planet. Each shares his abilities with other beings from the same planet, and so it would seem that unique evolutionary pressures are responsible for the existence of these capacities. But many questions remain unanswered at this point, and answers are slowly being pieced together by a team of experts. It really is a very intriguing gathering indeed.
A new synthetic fibre has been produced.
Okay, well, we're going to have to go back to get the results. So I'm sure you picked up what might have been fusion, what might have been oscillation, and what might have been displacement.
We bring you breaking news from a planet in a little-known region of a distant galaxy. A conference is taking...
You didn't, we'll just play it again. Oh, there we go. And we had two fillers on either end there. And so you probably picked up as well that the structure of the narratives for each were very similar, the length and so on was very similar, and the concepts included were very similar with this slight tweak. But here's what we found. We had two hypothesis-blind coders code the responses that were written for understanding according to the description of displacement, fusion, and oscillation that they had. And they found 31 people recorded accurately and completely displacement, 12 remembered fusion, and 11 remembered oscillation. Okay, and this is a significant difference between these categories. Fusion and oscillation broadly the same, and displacement way out there. And of the 23 participants who recalled either displacement or fusion, so if you're going to remember one of them, 22 recalled displacement and 1 recalled fusion. So the tiny tweak in mind-body arrangements of these three beings has a significant effect, despite maintaining the difficulty, length, structure, and much of the content of descriptions constant, and generating an entirely hypothetical, unfamiliar situation. Displacement was more consistently and accurately remembered than fusion and oscillation. A salient interpretation of this data is that displacement has clear cognitive mnemonic advantages over fusion and oscillation. These studies, along with others then, suggest that the success of the cross-culturally widespread displacement concept of possession is attributable in part to biases in the ways in which people reason about minds and bodies. Unless instructed otherwise, people will likely think of possession in terms of one mind, or soul, or agent, or spirit, displacing another, whether or not they have experienced trance, as in the case of this young woman seeking advice from a possessed individual. Even when instructed otherwise, intuitive defaults may be hard to override, as suggested by the ethnographic evidence. So to sum up my talk, the work reported here is just an illustration of how the methods and findings from cognitive science can turn once intractable problems into testable hypotheses, and of how a scientific understanding of religious experience may be enriched, perhaps enabled, by a scientific understanding of how human minds work. The term religious experience is often taken to signify something anomalous, otherworldly, mysterious, life-changing, mystical, ineffable, and so on. In fact, it appears that many of the most exotic religious experiences, such as possession trance, appeal to garden variety, everyday intuitions about how the world works. In seeking to account for possession experiences, for example, these intuitions constitute an important part of the phenomenon to be explained. This is not to suggest that the incidence of certain components of trance behavior couldn't be explained or described at the biological level, for example in terms of dietary deficiencies, as has been attempted in the past, or that a cognitive explanation is a complete explanation of possession trance phenomena, but simply that an account of the incidence of possession trance necessarily requires some means of identifying what possession is, in other words, how it is conceptualized, and the conditions under which people come to acquire and use such concepts. The cognitive anthropology of religion is not all new, but it certainly has a lot of new parts. If you'll permit me one more analogy, I'd like to think of it as a little bit like my old vintage Vespa, recently revived and back on the road again. A superficial glance would suggest that she still looks pretty much the same as she was 40 years ago, but a closer look would reveal that her course is determined by a shiny brand new engine. She might require more tools than before, some of which I can more easily figure out than others, but if they keep this beautiful thing on the road, it's worth it. The cognitive anthropology of religion is not so much new as back with a whole new engine and accompanying set of tools. There's a lot to explore, a lot to do, still more questions than answers, but as I hope this talk has illustrated, I think we're making progress. Thank you.